Well, hello, and welcome to this week's video lecture. So, this week we're only reading one story. Of course, it is a longer sort of collection of stories. Dennis Johnson's The Largesse of the Sea Maiden. So, first off, let's just start with one term that's going to help us understand all of the other terms, related to this. And that term is vignette. V-I-G-N-E-T-T-E. Vignette. A vignette is an incredibly short scene, less complete than a short story, that is often used in multiples and which creates meaning through juxtaposition. So let me say that again all at once. A vignette is a short scene, less complete than a story, often occurring in multiples, which create meaning through juxtaposition. So, if I can kind of unpack that, this story is made up of many different vignettes, each of which have their own title and their own little moment. These little page and a half, very short sort of things. I would say that individually, they definitely mean something, and they all kind of imply a part of a story. But if you want the whole story of what's going on in The Largesse of the Sea Maiden, what you have to do is look at each piece individually, determine the meanings of each piece individually, and then use that idea to open up and discuss what it means as a whole. So in other words, we think of each part individually and what its meaning might be, and then we see what meaning is suggested by putting all of these different little parts together and next to each other. So if you read through this, you'll find that many of them are sort of dark and seem to suggest, how harsh life can be and how difficult it is to age and how complex and hard human relationships can be. And other stories seem to suggest this brilliant love of life and this just acceptance of the beauty of the snow swirling around you in New York, and you go into a bar. And in either case, what does it mean that we have all of these different ideas? If we take each one individually and break it apart, what do we get out of that, right? So, those are vignettes, and that is an important idea to understand this story. Another thing I want to talk about that is just an important part of understanding fiction is the idea of narrators. So, in fiction, the narrator, and let me go ahead and get a definition for you straightforwardly that we will then add on. The narrator is the person or entity who is telling the story on the page. Whoever is speaking, in other words. In fiction, we can learn a lot about narrators. Knowing a lot about narrators tells us a lot about the story, and thus many stories are often delineated, broken into groups based on what kind of narrator they have. Two things we consider about the narrator is, one, their relationship to the characters in the story, and two, the amount of knowledge they have access to. So, in terms of the amount of knowledge they have access to, there are two big categories of narrators. There are omniscient narrators and close narrators. So let me spell for you. Omniscient, O-M-N-I-S-C-I-E-N-T, omniscient. An omniscient narrator is one who knows everything. And literally that's what the word omniscient means. It means all-knowing. So an omniscient narrator knows not just the thoughts and experiences of one character, but the thoughts and experiences of every character. So if you ever see a narrator who knows the thoughts of not only one character, but then they flip and they know the thoughts of the person they're talking to, or they zoom out and talk about something that one person could never possibly see, and you're dealing with an omniscient narrator, one who can see everything all at once. The opposite of an omniscient narrator is a close narrator. A close narrator only has access to one character's thoughts, opinions, and perspective. So, amongst omniscient and close narrators, we also must discuss the idea of first, second, and third person narrators. So this is that discussion of the narrator's relationship to the story. So if the narrator is in the story and they are talking about themselves, then we call that a first-person story. And we call it a first-person story because they use first-person pronouns. I, me, stuff like that. So if the person telling you the story refers to themselves using the words I, you know you have a first-person narrator. And almost all first-person narrators are close narrators, which kind of makes sense when you work it out. The most common other form of narrator that you'll get is a third-person narrator. And again, the name comes from the way that they use pronouns. So you will hear he, she, it, etc. instead of I did this, I did that. It's he did this, she did that. Third-person narrators can be both omniscient or close. So sometimes you will just get the perspective of one character and only get their perspective, but it's not told from their perspective. So instead of I did this, it's he did this, but we only get that narrow person's thoughts. We can't like zoom across the room and see what someone else is thinking at a given moment, and we can't zoom out and come back to it at a different time. So that is a third-person narrator. And again, they're using he, she, it. There is also such a thing as a second-person narrator. A second-person narrator is one that uses you. So the word you, these stories are not as common, but they do exist in the world. They kind of create this weird sort of tension where it's kind of halfway between the two. Because when everyone says, well, you know how it is, what they really mean is, well, in my opinion. So it's like, you know, you go to the store and you do this. They mean, well, I go to the store and I do this, right? So it's an interesting sort of experimental sort of a format that comes into play sometimes. Second-person narrators, honestly, not the most important, not the most common, but it's worth noting for your perspective. But I do need you to know the difference between a first-person and a third-person narrator, and the difference between an omniscient and a close narrator. That's the sort of thing you might find on your test, just throwing it out there. Okay, so that is all the words I want you guys to learn for this week. There might be another one that you see on your syllabus. I'm cutting that off just for the sake of convenience and removing repetition. If you have other questions or comments, let me know. Thanks so much.